The neighborhood had always been quiet, tucked away behind rows of manicured hedges and freshly painted fences. To outsiders, it looked like the picture of suburban peace. But behind the surface, the HOA had grown into something ugly, a group of enforcers who prowled the streets, barking at residents for the smallest infractions, wielding their authority like a weapon. My wife, Emily, had always tried to keep her head down, tending her roses and baking pies for neighbors. She believed kindness could soften even the hardest hearts. But that belief shattered the day the HOA decided she was their next target. It started with a letter. The HOA claimed Emily's flower beds did not conform to community standards and demanded she rip them out. She had planted those roses in honor of her late mother, nurturing them with the kind of care only she could give. She politely declined, sending a handwritten note explaining their meaning. For weeks, nothing happened. Then one hot afternoon, as she was watering the garden, two HOA enforcers marched up the driveway with clipboards in hand and arrogance dripping from every step. Emily greeted them with her usual gentle smile, but they didn't return it. "You were told to remove these plants," one of them barked. "This is your final warning." Emily, small and slender, tightened her grip on the hose and shook her head. "These roses stay. They aren't hurting anyone." That was when the second man, a burly figure with sunglasses, stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "Lady, if you won't listen, we'll make you listen." And then, without warning, he shoved her back against the fence. She cried out, stumbling into the thorns, her hands scratched and bleeding. The water hose fell from her grip, spraying across the driveway. One of the men laughed, muttering something about teaching her a lesson. They didn't know I was just around the corner, returning home from a run. My ears picked up her cry before I even saw her. And in that instant, the instincts I had spent years honing overseas came roaring back. When I turned into the driveway and saw Emily on the ground, my vision narrowed. My wife, the woman who had waited for me through deployments, the woman who had carried me through nightmares when I came home broken, was lying in the dirt while two cowards stood over her. Every lesson from the teams, every drill, every scar from battle, all of it sharpened into a single purpose. Protect. Eliminate the threat. The men barely had time to register my presence before I closed the distance. My voice cut through the air like a blade. "Step away from her." One turned, smirking. "And who are you supposed to be?" That smirk vanished when he saw my stance, feet planted, shoulders squared, eyes that had stared into war zones and walked out alive. "Her husband," I growled. "And your worst mistake." The first enforcer lunged, maybe thinking size would win him the fight. It didn't. In one swift move, I deflected his arm, spun him around, and slammed him face first into the hood of his own truck. The crack of metal against bone silenced the street. The second man tried to grab me from behind, but years of training had drilled in muscle memory too deep to fail. I twisted, seized his wrist, and with a controlled force, bent him to his knees, his scream echoing off the houses. Neighbors peeked from windows, some stepping onto porches, watching in stunned silence. They had seen the HOA bully people before, but never had anyone stood against them. They had never seen what happens when predators pick the wrong prey. My wife, still shaken, pulled herself up, her eyes wide as she clutched her arm. I met her gaze and gave her a small nod. She was safe now. I released the second man only long enough to shove him to the ground, both enforcers groaning, clutching their injuries. My voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that promised consequences. "You ever lay a hand on my wife again, you won't walk away next time. Do you understand me?" They nodded, too dazed to argue. The fear in their eyes told me they finally realized who they were dealing with, not a suburban pushover, but a man forged in fire. Emily clung to my arm, trembling, but there was pride in her tears. "I was so scared," she whispered. I kissed her forehead gently, my anger cooling into something steadier. "They'll never touch you again," I promised. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA had declared war on my family, and they had no idea what kind of enemy they had just awakened. The HOA board called an emergency meeting the next day. They painted me as a violent threat, spinning the story so that their enforcers appeared to be victims of assault. But the neighborhood had already seen the truth. Word of what happened spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered about how Emily was attacked, how the HOA crossed a line, and how I put their bullies in the dirt without breaking a sweat. The enforcers had bruises, but I had witnesses, and witnesses carried more weight than lies. Still, the war wasn't finished. Days later, I received a letter threatening legal action, fines, even eviction. They believed paper threats could scare me, the same way they scared everyone else. But I had faced far worse than a lawsuit. I'd stood against enemies who actually knew how to fight. This was just a neighborhood council drunk on power. And they had just stumbled into a battlefield they weren't equipped to survive. Instead of hiding, I went on the offensive. I started attending their meetings, walking in with my chest high, Emily at my side. Every time they tried to twist the narrative, I spoke with calm precision, laying out what really happened. I described how their enforcers shoved a woman in her own garden, how they laughed while she bled, how they thought intimidation would break her spirit. The room would go silent, neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, eyes narrowing at the board. The WA tried shouting me down, but the louder they got, the weaker they looked. I didn't need to yell. My voice carried the weight of discipline and truth. And soon, other residents began to step forward, recounting their own stories of harassment, unpaid fines, threats, property trespassing. My stand had given them courage. For the first time, the board's grip on the neighborhood began to crack. Then came the turning point. One of the enforcers, the bigger one with the sunglasses, broke under pressure. Maybe it was guilt, maybe fear, but he confessed that the board had ordered them to make an example out of Emily to scare other homeowners into compliance. That confession was all I needed. With witnesses, with testimony, with undeniable proof, the board's empire started to crumble. Lawyers became involved, but this time, they weren't on the HOA's side. Residents pooled together, filing lawsuits against the board for harassment, abuse of power, and even assault. I didn't have to lift another finger, the truth was a weapon sharper than any knife I'd carried in combat. Within months, the WA collapsed, its leaders resigning in disgrace, their bank accounts drained from settlements and legal fees. As for me and Emily, we found ourselves in a neighborhood that suddenly felt different. Without the HOA's chokehold, people started to breathe again. Families planted the gardens they wanted. Kids rode bikes without fear of complaints. The fences that once divided us became gathering places, where neighbors shared stories of victory and resilience. The scars from that day never left Emily's arm, but they became a badge of survival, a reminder of the day fear lost. Sometimes, when I sat on the porch in the evening, I'd see Emily tending her roses, sunlight dancing across her hair. I thought about how close I came to losing her peace, how close she came to being broken by people drunk on control. And I knew, deep in my bones, that protecting her would always be my greatest mission. Not overseas, not in uniform, but here, at home, where the war was quiet but just as dangerous. The enforcers disappeared, moving away in shame. The former board scattered, their reputations ruined. But I didn't carry hate for them anymore. They had taught me something. That true strength isn't in fists or fear, but in standing tall when the world tries to push you down. They thought they could bully my wife. They learned they picked the wrong man to provoke. Moral of the story: evil doesn't always come from enemies on distant battlefields, it can come from the people next door. But when arrogance and cruelty rise, courage and truth rise higher. Never underestimate the quiet protector, because sometimes, the fiercest warriors are the ones who fight not for glory, but for love.